In the autumn of 1943, the war entered its fifth year, and the German command began to look with concern towards the western coast of Europe. Because although the main weight of the fighting was in the east, in Italy, or in the skies above the cities of the Reich, it was evident that the Allies would sooner or later prepare a landing in France. The question was when and where it would occur, and what real capacity there was to resist it with the forces that remained available. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had been reappointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, a position he had held in previous years. From his headquarters in Paris, he insisted that the level of defenses along the coast was insufficient, with internal reports indicating that work was progressing slowly, that there was a lack of cement, steel, and timber, and that many of the divisions stationed in France were merely resting units before returning to Russia, which reduced their real value as combat troops. In several meetings at the Berghof, he conveyed these concerns directly to Hitler, who listened coldly and always diverted attention to the Eastern Front, convinced that the fate of the war was at stake there, while he saw the West as merely a secondary theatre. Tensions became more evident in the spring of 1943, when Rundstedt brought Hitler a detailed report on the state of the fortifications, the distribution of divisions, and the quality of the troops, hoping that this assessment would force a reinforcement in the West. However, Hitler responded that England was a frozen front and that resources could not be diverted from the east, where an offensive with thousands of tanks had to be prepared. With that response, Rundstedt returned to Paris frustrated, convinced that at the decisive moment he would be held responsible for the failure. In December of that same year, following Directive 40, construction of the so-called Atlantic Wall resumed with greater intensity. This line of coastal defences stretched from Norway to the Basque Country. Propaganda presented it as an insurmountable wall, but in reality it was a discontinuous chain of incomplete positions. There were concrete artillery bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank ditches and minefields, but most were in progress or made of substandard materials. Engineering reports indicated that many sites could barely withstand a naval bombardment, yet Hitler ordered several ports declared fortresses, known as Festungen, which were to hold out to the last man even if surrounded. At the same time, a new protagonist arrived in the West. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who, after his experience in Africa, had been appointed commander of Army Group B, responsible for a large part of the French coast. Rommel travelled hundreds of kilometres in his official car, inspecting beaches, cliffs, roads and villages, pointing out weak points and ordering the placement of sand obstacles, steel stakes, Czech hedgehogs, explosive charges and mines of all kinds. He would rise at dawn, have a quick breakfast with his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, and immediately set out to supervise the works, convinced that the only option was to stop the Allies at the very edge of the sea, because if they managed to penetrate inland, Allied air superiority would prevent any counterattack by armoured reserves. Rommel's vision clashed with that of Rundstedt, who preferred to keep the armoured divisions in the rear to launch them suddenly when the main point of attack was identified: the invasion. This dispute reflected a deeper problem: the confusing chain of command. Although Rundstedt was the supreme commander on the Western Front, Hitler maintained direct control of the reserve armoured divisions, which in practice meant that none could move without his personal authorization. Meanwhile, in Hitler's circle, life seemed to proceed with a strange normality. In early June 1944, at his residence in Berchtesgaden, he attended the wedding of Gretel Braun, Eva Braun's sister, to an SS officer, amid a celebration complete with music and abundant champagne. That same night, Martin Bormann became intoxicated to the point of unconsciousness, and Hitler himself, dressed in his grey uniform, retired early, convinced that the Allied invasion would be easily contained by the Atlantic Wall. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels repeatedly stated in speeches that the British and Americans would never dare to cross the Channel, insisting on the phrase, "They say they'll come, why don't they?" For Hitler, if the landing was repulsed, the Western Allies would abandon the war, and the Reich could concentrate entirely on defeating the Soviet Union. On the ground, however, commanders were more pessimistic. Rundstedt recalled Frederick the Great's maxim, "He who tries to defend everything defends nothing," and criticized the thousands of soldiers immobilized in Norway or scattered in port garrisons unable to maneuver, weakening the mobile defences in the interior. He estimated that in northern France alone there were 120,000 men trapped in fixed positions who could not be moved if the situation demanded. Rommel's inspections showed the same thing: unfinished bunkers, artillery positions lacking ammunition, rusty barbed wire, poorly trained troops, and a Luftwaffe incapable of securing the skies. That's why he insisted on laying mines on the beaches and filling the nearby fields with obstacles, because every meter of coastline would be transformed into hell for the invaders. In his opinion, the battle would be decided in the first 6 hours of the landing. Despite these warnings, Hitler maintained his Festungen system and centralized reserves. In his written orders, he prohibited retreat and stipulated that strongholds should hold out to the last round, with the goal of halting the Allied advance and gaining time, even if it meant sacrificing thousands of soldiers. The generals believed this strategy immobilized their forces and contradicted the principles of maneuver that the German General Staff had always practiced. During the months of March, April and May of 1944, Rommel intensified his inspection tours. He visited sectors such as Calais, Normandy and Brittany, spoke with officers and non-commissioned officers, demanded that trenches be dug, camouflaged shelters be built, and anti-tank guns be installed at beach exits. He often put pressure on work units composed of French prisoners or requisitioned personnel because time was short and resources were scarce. In the OKW's internal documentation, reports from von Rundstedt and Bodo Zimmermann, his operations officer, warned of the weakness of the system and that the Allies were amassing unprecedented strength in England. Still, Hitler continued trusting that the main offensive would come through Calais and that the improvised defences of Normandy would be sufficient to contain a secondary attack. By the spring of 1944, intelligence reports clearly indicated that the Allies had amassed a massive landing fleet in England, with thousands of ships, aircraft and divisions ready to cross the Channel. However, confusion about the exact location of the invasion continued to prevail at German headquarters, as Hitler was convinced the primary objective would be the shortest passage, the Strait of Calais, while some officers, such as Rommel, noted that Normandy offered wide, accessible beaches that could be targeted. After months of inspections, Field Marshal Rommel had concluded that if the Allies managed to establish a beachhead, it would be impossible to dislodge them, as their air superiority prevented the movement of reserves during the day. Therefore, he advocated the idea of confronting the invasion on the sand, with direct firing positions on the shore, submerged obstacles that would destroy boats, and minefields that would multiply casualties before the first men could organize. His obsession was to transform every kilometer of beach into a death trap. The contrast was stark with Rundstedt, who preferred to leave the armored divisions a few kilometers in the rear and launch a massive counterattack once the enemy revealed its main landing point. This difference of opinion escalated into open conflict between the two marshals, as neither could convince the Führer, who retained personal control of the armored units. The practical consequence was that when the day came, no general could move a single tank without authorization from Berlin. The chain of command in the west was thus divided into 3 levels: Rundstedt as supreme commander, Rommel at the head of Army Group B, and Hitler himself deciding on reserves. Furthermore, the presence of SS, Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine units added further complications, as each branch obeyed its own system of orders and did not always collaborate with the army. Internal documents from April and May of that year contain constant complaints about the lack of basic materials. German engineers reported that many bunkers lacked armored doors, that guns were mounted in improvised positions, and that a shortage of concrete made it impossible to complete all the bunkers. In several sectors of Normandy, there was only barbed wire and shallow trenches, while local officers demanded more mines and artillery. Rommel tried to compensate for these shortcomings with ingenuity. He ordered wooden stakes laced with explosive charges to be placed on the beaches to destroy landing craft, installed so-called Czech hedgehogs made of steel beams, and oversaw the construction of camouflage dugouts for infantry. He also insisted that the stationed divisions train to fire directly at ships as soon as they appeared on the horizon. Rommel's operations diary records statements in which he stated that the first few hours would be decisive, that everything would be decided within that limited time. For him, if the Allies managed to penetrate beyond the sand, the battle would be lost. Rundstedt, on the other hand, he repeated that dispersing forces on each beach weakened the ability to react, and that the German army had always won thanks to its mobility, not by remaining static. Hitler stood firm in his position. He declared several cities as fortresses, including Cherbourg, Brest and Bordeaux, and prohibited their garrisons from withdrawing even if they were isolated. He also ordered that troops from the Channel Islands not be transferred, convinced that the British would try to recapture them rather than attack another part of France. This decision immobilized tens of thousands of men who would have reinforced Normandy. In the weeks leading up to the landings, German soldiers stationed on the coast lived in unequal conditions. Some units had solid bunkers and abundant ammunition, while others were in open positions with obsolete weapons. In Normandy, the famous 352nd Division, which would eventually face the Americans at Omaha, had been sent from the interior to reinforce the coastal defenses, although many of its recruits were inexperienced young men or soldiers recovering from wounds. The Luftwaffe could barely guarantee reconnaissance flights, as Allied air dominance was almost absolute. Every time a German plane took off, it risked being intercepted by Allied fighters. The same was true for vehicle movements. During the day, convoys were bombed by fighter bombers, forcing them to move only at night and to hide trucks and tanks under trees. In May, Rommel again toured the Normandy positions. At Colleville-sur-Mer, he noted the similarity of the beach to Salerno, Italy, where the Allies had landed months earlier, and declared to his officers that this sector would be decisive for the fate of Europe. With this in mind, he reinforced the deployment of mines, cannons, and resistance nests. Testimonies from ordinary soldiers collected years later confirmed that many of them were men wounded in other campaigns or veterans with limited physical capacity assigned to the Atlantic Wall because they could serve in fixed positions. Some were grateful not to have been sent to the Russian front, even though they knew the threat of invasion was imminent. They spent their days digging trenches, monitoring the sea, and listening to rumors about the imminent arrival of a gigantic enemy armada. On June 3rd, while Rommel was in Germany visiting his family, Gretel Braun's wedding to an SS officer was being celebrated at the Berghof. Hitler attended as host, and the festivities continued with music and drinks, contrasting sharply with the tension on the coast. Bormann became intoxicated, and Hitler himself left early, confident that the Atlantic Wall would hold. Goebbels's speeches continued to fuel the idea that England would not dare to cross, but the tone among the army's middle ranks was more somber. There was a general feeling that the invasion was imminent and that success depended on withstanding the first blow. On the evening of June 5th, while the storm was leading many officials to believe that there would be an immediate landing, the garrisons remained in their positions, some relaxed, others tense. The sentries watched a dark horizon, unaware that in a few hours they would see the appearance of the largest fleet in history. The German generals were still debating the exact location. Hitler went to bed late, convinced that it was all a diversionary maneuver and that the real attack would come at Calais. Rundstedt waited uncertainly for news from his command post, while Rommel, who had traveled to Germany, was not present at the front in those decisive hours. In the early hours of June 6th, the first reports began to arrive, indicating intense bombing in Normandy. At first, there were doubts about whether this was a limited attack or a major invasion, but the magnitude of the Allied movement soon dispelled any uncertainty. Telephones and radios at headquarters began to ring relentlessly, and within minutes the alarm system was activated along the entire coast. The men of the divisions stationed in Normandy rushed into their battle positions, adjusting their helmets and weapons, while the sky echoed with the roar of thousands of aircraft, and the sea filled with the shadows of ships moving slowly toward the shore. For many of those soldiers, the day was just beginning, and it would mark the beginning of the end of German dominance in Western Europe. Rommel facing the sea, inspections and defences in Normandy. At the end of January 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel toured the Normandy coast to assess preparations for the expected invasion. That stretch of coastline was known to the French as the Côte de Nacre, the mother-of-pearl coast, for its light sand beaches that attracted visitors from Paris in the summer. Rommel's car stopped between Colleville-sur-Mer and Vieilleville-sur-Mer, where he observed a flat strip of sand that stretched for several kilometers, bordered by cliffs at both ends and scattered with houses along the shore. Upon seeing the place, he compared it to Salerno, Italy, where the Allies had successfully landed months earlier. He told his companions that this sector must be protected immediately because the fate of Europe could be decided there. The area would later be codenamed Omaha Beach and would become the scene of the bloodiest day for the American forces. The German divisions defending that coast, especially the 716th Infantry and the 352nd, were uncertain of their ability to hold out if the offensive was concentrated there. Rommel realized that preparations were insufficient and that time was running out. The German Field Marshal, known until then as the Desert Fox for his campaigns in Africa, had changed his outlook on the war after suffering enemy air superiority on that continent. He was convinced that the same would happen in France, that the skies would be dominated by Allied aircraft, and that any attempt to move reserves in broad daylight would end in destruction. For this reason, he insisted on reinforcing every meter of beach with mines, obstacles, and resistance nests, because in his opinion, the landing should be stopped at the shore itself. For weeks, Rommel made daily trips across Normandy from the western sectors of the Cotentin Peninsula to the eastern beaches. He would rise early, have breakfast with his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, and then hop in his car to supervise construction, confer with engineers, order new trenches, and review mine laying. He often improvised unannounced inspections, surprised by the slowness of construction or the lack of materials. He ordered thousands of obstacles placed in the sand, from wooden stakes laced with explosives to steel structures known as Czech hedgehogs. He also arranged for underwater charges to be set up to blow up landing craft when the tide rose. He insisted on multiplying the minefields and positioning anti-tank guns at the beach exits. Every detail seemed crucial to him, because his conclusion was that everything would be resolved in the first few hours, and that after that, there would be no possibility of reaction. Rommel's position clashed with Rundstedt's, who preferred to keep armoured divisions further back to launch them suddenly in a counterattack. This disagreement was exacerbated by the fact that Hitler reserved the right to authorize any tank movement, which in practice meant that no one could act quickly without his order. The argument was never resolved, and consequently, the defense was divided between two opposing views that ultimately immobilized resources. Locally, officers of the 352nd Division were concerned that their troops were largely young, inexperienced men or soldiers recovering from wounds. Even so, they were assigned to a critical sector that included Omaha, with artillery positions on the bluffs and bunkers still unfinished. The lack of concrete and steel made the work difficult to complete, and in many cases the guns were protected only by incomplete walls. Testimonies later collected by German journalists revealed that many of the men sent to the Atlantic Wall were veterans with physical injuries or recruits without adequate training. However, because they were in static positions like bunkers or small forts, they were considered capable of carrying out the defense. One example was the Tobruk, small circular casemates in which a single soldier manned a machine gun from a narrow opening, supported by a comrade who remained underground ready to replace him. These structures were scattered along roads and around beaches to hinder the advance of paratroopers or infantry. Rommel observed with frustration that the Luftwaffe could not secure the skies and that supply convoys were constantly attacked by fighter bombers. Therefore, he recommended camouflaging each vehicle, moving them only at night, and hiding ammunition dumps under forests. Fuel shortages were another problem. Many units could barely train with their tanks, and every litre had to be saved for invasion day. During his inspections, Rommel also took note of the coastal towns, where he ordered the reinforcement of concrete houses and their conversion into firing points. Some villas overlooking the sea were transformed into fortresses with cement roofs, loopholes, and anti-tank guns, creating a network of resistance that was intended to halt any advance. Every bridge and crossroads was attended to, with explosive charges ready to be detonated if the Allies managed to break through. Rommel himself criticized Hitler's speeches to the generals, ironically calling them rays of sunshine that failed to resolve the real problems. However, he never ceased to fulfill his task and seek practical solutions. In the final weeks of May, he redoubled the pressure on engineers and troops, aware that an invasion was imminent. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler remained convinced that the main landing would be at Calais. This confidence led him to immobilize garrisons on the Channel Islands and declare cities like Cherbourg and Brest fortresses that would resist to the last bullet. Such decisions dispersed forces and limited maneuverability, but Hitler believed they ensured absolute control and prevented unauthorized withdrawals. The reports from the West were increasingly alarming. Rundstedt insisted that resources were insufficient and that the Western Front could not sustain a prolonged invasion. Rommel pointed out that the enemy had to be stopped on the beach or all would be lost. Hitler, however, maintained his priorities in the east, convinced that the decisive battle lay there. In this climate of disagreement and shortages, the soldiers stationed in Normandy continued digging trenches, laying mines, and monitoring the sea. Some did so with resignation, others with some hope that the invasion might be delayed, but all knew that sooner or later they would have to face it. In May 1944, as the invasion date drew closer, Rommel further intensified his coastal patrols. Each visit pointed out weak points, requested more mines, more obstacles, and more weapons, even though he knew that German industry could not meet all these needs. Military engineers reported that the quantity of concrete sent was insufficient and that many positions remained half-built, leaving the defensive line exposed. Despite the limitations, Rommel ordered that every stretch of beach be strewn with obstacles. Logs sloping toward the sea were laid with mines on the tips, designed to destroy landing craft when the tide rose. Iron crosses and concrete blocks were also placed, forming a maze that would force ships to slow down and troops to advance under fire. Each road exit leading inland was provided with anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. Reports from local units describe soldiers spending entire days carrying sandbags, laying barbed wire, and digging dugouts. Many were men recovering from wounds or with little training, assigned there because the static positions required less physical exertion than the Eastern Front. However, Rommel did not consider them useless, as in his plans every bunker and every trench had to play a role on the front line. The Field Marshal clearly saw that Allied air dominance would be total. In his conversations with officers, he repeatedly stated that the fighter bombers would prevent any movement during the day, thus trapping the reserves. That was why he insisted that the coastal infantry divisions bear the initial blow. The phrase he used was that the battle would decide in the first hours, before the enemy managed to consolidate. Rundstedt's opposition remained. From his headquarters in Paris, the veteran marshal argued that the history of the German army demonstrated that victory was achieved through mobility, not rigidity. For him, concentrating forces on the shore meant losing the ability to counterattack decisively. He proposed keeping the armored divisions several kilometers from the coast and launching them in a massive attack. But that idea was blocked by Hitler's direct intervention. The Führer not only prohibited the withdrawal of troops without his order, but also reserved the right to decide on the use of armored divisions. This centralization created a slow and bureaucratic system that effectively paralyzed the German reaction. When the landing arrived, none of these units could move without personal authorization, which meant hours of delay. Meanwhile, official propaganda portrayed the Atlantic Wall as an insurmountable barrier. Newsreels showed images of solid bunkers, artillery in casemates, and prepared soldiers, although the reality was very different. In Normandy, many positions were improvised. Artillery pieces were in incomplete shelters, and ammunition supplies were limited. Even so, French civilians forced to work on the construction site confirmed that the deployment was impressive given the number of mines and obstacles covering the coast. Testimonies collected years later revealed that the soldiers in these garrisons lived with a mixture of routine and anxiety. Patrols watched the coast at night, sentries watched the channel from improvised towers, and non-commissioned officers organized shooting exercises with available weapons. Many spent their time writing letters, chatting, or repairing trenches, knowing that the landing could arrive at any moment. Rommel pressed for an acceleration. In a report, he described how he wanted to see thousands of mines laid every day, and that if the enemy landed, they would find a minefield so dense they could not advance. He also ordered the reinforcement of villages near the coast, converting houses and farms into fortified points. Each building was to serve as both a refuge and an obstacle on the way inland. The effort was enormous, but it failed to transform the entire coast into an impenetrable line. Some sections were well defended, with heavy artillery and concrete bunkers, and others were barely covered with trenches and barbed wire. The difference in preparation from one point to another was notable, creating gaps that the Allies could exploit. By early June, Rommel was convinced that an invasion was imminent. However, a storm in the Channel led him to believe that the Allies would delay their offensive, and he took the opportunity to travel to Germany to visit his family. This trip took him away from the front just in the critical hours leading up to June 6th. Meanwhile, Hitler remained confident that the main attack would be on Calais. He therefore kept divisions immobilized in that area, believing that Normandy would be a deception or a secondary maneuver. This conviction proved decisive, as it meant that the forces in Normandy had to face the landing with limited resources. On the eve of the invasion, the coastal garrisons continued their routine. Some officers organized dinners in nearby villages, others conducted a final check on their positions. No one suspected that within a few hours, the largest armada in history would appear. When the first reports arrived at dawn on June 6th, the telephones at Rundstedt barracks began to ring relentlessly, and the German defences went on alert. In the Normandy positions, the soldiers rushed to their bunkers, adjusted their helmets, and prepared their weapons. In front of them, the sea was covered with slowly advancing ships, accompanied by the constant roar of aircraft. It was the beginning of the clash that would test all the months of work of Rommel and his men and demonstrate whether coastal defences could truly stop the enemy on shore. The early morning of June 6th, confusion in the High Command. On the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, a storm in the Channel led many German officers to believe that the Allied invasion would not occur immediately. Weather reports indicated heavy waves and overcast skies, which seemed to rule out a large-scale landing. Therefore, several commanders allowed their men to rest, some officers attended social gatherings, and even short leaves were planned. Routine operations continued without major incidents, with patrols along the coast and sentries in post, but without the tension that would have accompanied the certainty of an imminent attack. At that same time, Erwin Rommel was far from the front. He had travelled to Germany to visit his wife and buy birthday presents for his son, convinced that bad weather would delay any enemy operations. In Paris, Rundstedt waited for news from his headquarters, but there were no clear signs that the offensive had begun. And in Berchtesgaden, Hitler had retired to rest after a busy day of minor meetings, confident that the main landing would arrive through Calais, not Normandy. The dawn brought a sudden change. In the early hours of June 6th, intense air and naval bombardment of Normandy's coastal defences began. Communications began to jam with reports of paratroopers landing in various areas, creating confusion as to whether these were real attacks or just diversionary operations. Radio operators reported explosions, artillery fire, and movements along the coast, while sentries warned of the presence of ships approaching from the horizon. Within minutes, the telephones in German command posts began ringing relentlessly. Army Group B headquarters received conflicting reports. Some spoke of small landings on the Cotentin Peninsula, others of attacks in Calvados, and still others claimed it was a minor operation. The full extent of the Allied fleet was still unclear in the darkness, and officers debated whether what was happening was the main offensive or a deception. In Paris, Rundstedt immediately requested authorization to mobilize the armored divisions in reserve. His advisors reminded him that this decision depended solely on Hitler, which meant they would have to wait for the Führer to wake up. Attempts to reach him proved futile in the early hours, as he had retired late to rest, and no one dared to wake him without an express order. This delay cost valuable time. Meanwhile, in the Normandy barracks, the men of the 352nd and 716th Divisions rushed into position. Gunners adjusted their sights, soldiers loaded their rifles, and officers reviewed maps illuminated by flashlights. The roar of the sea began to be drowned out by a metallic roar. The Allied fleet, composed of thousands of ships, was slowly approaching the coast. For the German soldiers stationed in bunkers and trenches, the sight was shocking, a horizon littered with silhouettes stretching as far as the eye could see. The confusion in command contrasted with the immediacy of the situation on the ground. The gunners began firing at the shadows of the ships, while Allied paratroopers continued to fall inside, some deflected by the wind, increasing German confusion. The messages reaching the command centers were chaotic. Some spoke of hundreds of paratroopers, others of simple, isolated groups. Some claimed the offensive was directed toward Cherbourg, others that the objective was Caen. In the early hours of the day, radar and observation stations confirmed that the fleet off Normandy was enormous. However, distrust of the reports led to widespread speculation in Berlin and Hitler's headquarters that it could be a maneuver to divert attention from Calais. This idea further delayed the release of the armored reserves. The soldiers on the coast had no time for such discussions. In Utah and Omaha, on Gold, Juno, and Sword, the garrisons opened fire on the first landing craft. The beaches lit up with explosions, tracers, and machine gun bursts. In some sectors, the bunkers held firm under the naval bombardment. In others, they were destroyed in a matter of minutes. The surviving German officers later recounted that the ground shook as if from an earthquake, and that communications were constantly interrupted by the impacts. In Paris, Rundstedt insisted once again that the situation was serious and that immediate action was needed. His operations commanders tried to sort out the avalanche of reports, but the lack of a clear line of command and the wait for orders from Berlin made a coordinated response impossible. When Hitler was finally informed in the morning, he believed that what was happening in Normandy could still be a secondary attack and that the real landing would come at Calais. This interpretation paralyzed the armored divisions during the crucial hours of dawn. Meanwhile, Rommel's men, deprived of his direct presence because the Marshal remained in Germany, resisted with what they had. At Omaha, the 352nd Division's guns fired at the approaching boats, while machine guns swept the beach. At Utah, the defenders watched as the currents drifted the Americans, giving them an initial advantage. At Sword and Juno, the bunkers responded to naval fire with everything they could. Accounts from privates, collected years later, recalled their surprise at the size of the fleet. Many spoke of a sea covered in ships, low-flying planes, and the constant sound of explosions. Some artillery officers tried to remain calm and give clear orders, but communications repeatedly dropped out, forcing them to take improvised decisions. The German chain of command was caught between hesitation and slowness. Rundstedt pressed for a reaction, Hitler hesitated, Rommel was absent, and the armored divisions remained motionless awaiting orders. This lack of coordination allowed the Allies to advance at several points, despite initial losses. When Rommel was informed of the invasion of Germany, he hurriedly tried to return to his headquarters, but the lost time was already irretrievable. By then, the battle in Normandy was raging, and the defenders were holding out as best they could, aware that they were facing an attack far greater than they had imagined. As the morning of June 6th progressed, the magnitude of the Allied attack could no longer be hidden. Reports reaching Paris and Berlin confirmed that a massive force had landed in Normandy, supported by an overwhelming number of ships and aircraft. Radars showed incessant ship traffic crossing the channel, and observers described beaches covered with men and vehicles. Despite this evidence, the perception in Hitler's headquarters still held that the landing was merely a diversionary attack and that the real blow would come later at Calais. This interpretation proved fatal to the German reaction. Rundstedt again urgently requested the use of the armored divisions but received the same response. The decision rested solely with the Führer. When the movement was finally authorized, the most critical hours of the morning had already passed, and the Allies had managed to establish beachheads in several sectors. In Normandy, the defenders continued to hold out with what they had. At Omaha, the guns of the 352nd Division continued firing from the cliffs, inflicting heavy losses on the Americans trying to cross the sands under constant fire. However, naval and air bombardment destroyed position after position, and communications between bunkers were disrupted. Soldiers reported being forced to improvise, running between half-destroyed trenches and trying to keep machine guns working as the ground shook under the impact. In Utah, the landing was diverted several kilometers from its objective by the currents. This deviation favored the Germans initially because their strongest positions were out of reach, but it also allowed the Americans to advance through a less well-defended sector. The Germans in that area were outnumbered and unable to prevent the invaders from penetrating further inland. In the British and Canadian sectors, the situation was equally chaotic. At Sword and Juno, the bunkers opened fire on the boats, but the Allied bombardment quickly weakened the positions. At Gold, German artillery managed to sink several boats, although the enemy pressure was too great. The German soldiers. Those who survived later recounted that they had never seen such a coordinated attack, with ships firing from the sea, planes dropping bombs, and thousands of men advancing at the same time. While this was happening on the beaches, Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris was trying to organize a response. Staff officers debated how to concentrate forces, but the lack of freedom to move reserves made everything futile. When the order was finally given to move some armored divisions, the convoys attempting to advance were relentlessly attacked by Allied aircraft which completely dominated the skies. Tanks and trucks were destroyed on roads and bridges, further delaying any counterattack. Rommel, upon learning of the invasion, hurried back from Germany. During the car ride, he helplessly watched columns of smoke on the horizon and heard reports that the beaches were already filled with enemy troops. Upon arriving at his headquarters, he found the situation critical and that decisions had been made too late. His belief that everything would be decided in the first few hours was confirmed, and that those hours were already lost. The testimonies of soldiers who fought at the resistance points show the contrast between the propaganda of the Atlantic Wall and reality. Many recalled that their bunkers were destroyed in minutes, that the cannons were silenced by naval fire, and that the artillery could only fire a few shells before being neutralized. Others recounted their surprise at seeing the Allies deploy amphibious vehicles, engineers, and specialized equipment to clear a path through mines and obstacles, something they were unprepared for. The confusion within the German High Command continued. Hitler insisted that Calais remained the primary objective and refused to transfer forces from that sector. This obstinacy kept tens of thousands of soldiers pinned down in a location where no landing would take place, while the defenders in Normandy were gradually overwhelmed. By mid-afternoon, the reports were clear. The Allies had consolidated positions on all beaches and were landing vehicles, artillery, and fresh troops. German units attempting to counterattack were being destroyed by aircraft, and communications between divisions were constantly being disrupted. Rundstedt told his officers that the battle was being lost, but he still issued orders to hold each position to the bitter end. For the soldiers on the ground, the day seemed endless. Many spent hours inside bunkers under constant fire, the air filled with smoke and dust. Those who survived said they couldn't lift their heads without risking being hit by shells or machine gun fire. The noise was deafening, and the feeling of total isolation was felt as radios were destroyed and telephone lines were cut. By nightfall, the Allies had managed to secure several connected beachheads. Although losses had been high, their superiority in numbers and means was evident. The Germans continued to fight in isolated areas, but the overall reaction capacity was broken. Rommel, assessing the situation, understood that the hours the losses during the morning had been decisive. Rundstedt agreed with this assessment, although he continued to issue orders for resistance in public. Hitler, for his part, insisted that what had happened could still be a deception, which prolonged the lack of a clear strategy. The first day of the invasion ended with the Germans overwhelmed on all sides. The Atlantic Wall had proven to be more fragile than the propaganda had claimed, and confusion in the High Command had prevented an effective response. For the soldiers who survived on the beaches, June 6th would be remembered as the day the war turned in the West. The Devil's Garden, Omaha, and the Bloody Clash. The beach known as Omaha stretched for several kilometers, bordered by cliffs at either end and with terrain favorable to the defenders. Since January 1944, Rommel had identified this sector as one of the most vulnerable and ordered it reinforced with obstacles, mines, and resistance nests. In his view, the combination of flat sand, narrow access paths, and dominant hills made it a likely landing point. The main defense was in the hands of the 352nd Infantry Division, supported by elements of the 716th. The 352nd had arrived in March to relieve other, less experienced units. It was made up of young recruits alongside veterans recovering from wounds, many of them inadequately trained. Even so, they were assigned the mission of defending one of the most critical sectors of the Atlantic Wall. The German positions included concrete bunkers with 75mm guns, bunkers with MG-42 machine guns, and small structures known as Tobrücks, from which a single man could fire with limited visibility but good protection. Obstacles had also been placed in the sand, wooden stakes laced with mines, steel crosses and concrete blocks designed to destroy landing craft. Each exit from the beach into the interior was covered by anti-tank guns and machine gun nests positioned high above the sand. On June 6th, from the early hours of the morning, the defenders watched as the horizon line was covered with ships. The gunners opened fire on the fleet, although the Allied response was immediate with naval bombardments that shook the positions. The bunkers shook with each impact and telephone lines were cut one after another. Despite this, several batteries managed to maintain their fire and hit several boats in the first landing attempts. The soldiers in the bunkers described the scene as a hell of noise and smoke. The roar of naval gunfire mingled with bursts of machine gun fire and the explosions of bombs dropped from the air. The ground was filled with craters and the air with dust, hampering communication and visibility. The defenders fired relentlessly, aware that every minute gained could delay the Allied advance. In the central sector of Omaha, the points of resistance known as WN-62 and WN-71 played a key role. From there, German machine guns had fields of fire that covered much of the beach. The soldiers fired continuous bursts at the lines of Americans trying to advance from the boats toward the sand. The sight of thousands of men running under concentrated fire was described by the Germans as overwhelming, although they had no option but to continue firing until they ran out of ammunition. In some bunkers, the defenders were buried by the bombardment and only the survivors could continue firing from their semi-destroyed positions. The lack of communications prevented coordination with other points of resistance, so each group fought in isolation, responding only to what they saw in front of them. The gunners tried to keep their guns operational, but many cannons were rendered useless by direct hits from the fleet. The ground behind the beach was covered with barbed wire, anti-tank ditches and minefields, meaning that even if the Allies managed to reach the foot of the cliffs, they would still face more obstacles. However, the attackers' vast numerical and technical superiority allowed them to gradually gain ground. The German defenders fired from narrow windows or camouflaged embrasures, trying to maintain pressure on the enemy infantry seeking cover behind any uneven terrain. Later accounts from German soldiers present in Omaha agreed that the noise was unbearable and the air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to breathe and see clearly. Some described the machine gun bursts as seemingly endless, while others recalled running out of ammunition in the middle of the battle and having to improvise with whatever they found. Field Marshal Rommel wasn't present in Normandy that day, but his insistence on fortifying the beaches with obstacles and mines had left a clear mark. The Americans found a field littered with defenses that cost them enormous losses to overcome. The combination of high-altitude artillery, machine guns in bunkers, and sand traps turned Omaha into the bloodiest sector of the entire invasion. By mid-morning, the German positions continued to fire against the assault waves. The defenders saw some groups of Americans trapped in the sand, unable to advance or retreat. The German guns knocked out boats and vehicles, but the pressure continued. Every hour, more ships, more men, and more equipment arrived to join the attack. The defenders began to feel physical and psychological exhaustion, although they continued to comply with orders to resist. Losses were heavy on both sides. The Americans suffered thousands of casualties in the first few hours, while the German defenders were reduced to small, isolated groups, many of them without any reinforcements or ammunition. Still, the order was clear: hold out to the last round. The day in Omaha showed the brutal reality of the Atlantic Wall. What the propaganda presented as an invincible system was actually a set of fortified positions that could cause enormous damage, but lacked to completely halt a force of such magnitude. For the German soldiers trapped in those bunkers, June 6th was a day of desperate resistance, with the sea and sky covered in enemies and the certainty that they were facing an attack impossible to contain alone. As the morning of June 6th progressed, the Omaha sector became one of the bloodiest areas of the entire invasion. The German defenders, mostly from the 352nd Division, continued to fire from bunkers, trenches, and fortified houses, even as they suffered the brunt of naval and air artillery every minute. The Allied ships' guns pounded the cliff positions and beach exits, sending up columns of smoke that covered the horizon. German soldiers, trapped in the strongholds, described how the ground shook constantly, as if each impact could bury their shelters. Some bunkers were destroyed by direct blasts, forcing survivors to emerge and fire from improvised positions. Others held partially, but with damage that made it difficult to keep the weapons operational. In many cases, machine gunners changed positions repeatedly, covering different angles until they ran out of ammunition. The crossfire continued to cause enormous losses among the American troops, who tried to advance from the shore toward the cliffs. However, the numerical pressure was overwhelming. More and more boats arrived on the beach, disembarking men, vehicles, and light artillery. The defenders watched as, despite the losses, the enemy groups found natural cover in the craters opened by the bombardment and organized themselves to continue advancing. Key positions, such as resistance point WN62, remained active for hours, firing at any movement in the sand. There, the German defenders recalled that the Americans advanced slowly, crawling under fire, halting behind scraps of wood or destroyed obstacles. The fighting was constant and exhausting, with machine gun fire, hand grenades, and anti-tank gunfire. By midday, the situation was beginning to deteriorate. The Allies had managed to penetrate several sectors and were beginning to scale the cliffs. The defenders attempted to halt them with bursts of machine gun fire from loopholes, but the pressure was too great. The arrival of Allied engineers with explosives made it possible to breach the barbed wire and destroy fortifications. The Germans inside the bunkers later recalled that the smoke and dust were so thick they could barely see a few meters ahead. The physical and psychological strain on the defenders was mounting. The lack of water, food, and ammunition made every minute more difficult. Many soldiers had spent the previous night on alert, and by this point in the day were barely able to stand. Even so, the orders were clear: hold out until the end. Some German units attempted to counterattack in small groups. They launched themselves from inland positions towards the beach, trying to push the Allies back to the sea. However, naval artillery and aviation made this impossible. Every movement in open country was punished with a hail of shells. Counterattacks were defeated before reaching the enemy line. Testimonies collected years later reflect the German soldiers' bewilderment at the magnitude of the Allied deployment. Many claimed they never imagined the fleet would be so large, nor that the landings would be carried out with such coordination. Cannons fired relentlessly from the sea, planes bombed in waves, and boats continued to arrive without ceasing. For the defenders, the impression was that they were facing an inexhaustible enemy. From the wall to the retreat, collapse and retreat to the Reich. After June 6, 1944, the German forces in Normandy faced a situation beyond any previous calculations. The beaches were lost, and the Allies were advancing inland with a constant flow of men, vehicles, and ammunition. The defenders who had survived the first day retreated in disarray, while the armored divisions attempted to move forward. However, enemy air dominance made every movement a risk. Allied fighter bombers scoured the skies around the clock, attacking roads, tank columns, and bridges. Every attempt to move reinforcements ended in aerial ambushes that destroyed the convoys. German officers described how impossible it was to move units during the day because any vehicle spotted was destroyed within minutes. Only at night could progress be made, and even then with extreme caution, using secondary roads and hiding in forests or villages. Field Marshal Rommel, who had returned from Germany after the invasion, toured the affected areas and witnessed the magnitude of the disaster. He reported that Allied air power was so dominant that even heavy artillery could not be deployed without being destroyed. His recommendations insisted that it was useless to hold positions in open fields and that the only viable option was to hold in fortified points or withdraw to regroup. Rundstedt agreed with this assessment and repeatedly asked Hitler for permission to retreat and form a new line of defense further inland, but was always refused. The orders from Berlin were inflexible. Every meter had to be defended without giving ground. Hitler declared cities and towns as fortresses, forcing their garrisons to resist to the last man. This policy immobilized tens of thousands of soldiers in isolated positions, which sooner or later were surrounded and destroyed. The logic of sacrificing entire units to gain time was rejected by the commanders in the field, but no one dared to directly contradict the Führer. Meanwhile, the Allies continued to land reinforcements in numbers the Germans could not match. Within days, the British, Canadians and Americans had secured beachheads with thousands of vehicles, tanks and guns. From the German perspective, the Atlantic Wall had failed in its primary function, and a battle of attrition that seemed impossible to win was now underway. Wehrmacht reports indicated that the divisions in Normandy were suffering constant losses. Artillery was destroyed by bombardment, tanks were knocked out along the roads, and infantry units were being reduced by the day. Soldiers' morale plummeted in the face of the obvious inability to match enemy firepower. Even so, officers maintained discipline and passed on orders to resist. In the Normandy hinterland, towns like Caen were transformed into battlefields. The Germans fortified the streets, with anti-tank guns hidden among the ruins and machine gun nests on every corner. However, Allied artillery and aircraft reduced the number of attacks. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble, forcing defenders to fight among destroyed buildings. The sound of the bombing was constant, and survivors reported spending hours under fire without being able to lift their heads. Rommel warned that continuing to resist in Normandy would only mean losing men and materiel with no hope of success. He proposed retreating toward the Seine and reorganizing the defense there, but Hitler rejected this suggestion and repeated his order to hold. For the Führer, every day of resistance delayed the Allied offensive and allowed for the reorganization of other fronts, even if that strategy cost thousands of lives. The German divisions attempted to improvise local counterattacks. In some sectors, they managed to temporarily halt the enemy advance, but the Allied air and numerical superiority negated any progress. Every time German tanks massed, they were spotted from the air and destroyed with precision. Soldiers reported that it was useless to maneuver during the day, as it only took a few minutes for fighter bombers to appear and devastate everything. The chain of command also suffered from internal tensions. Rommel insisted on adapting to the reality of the battlefield, while Rundstedt pressed for a strategic withdrawal. Hitler, on the other hand, remained convinced that stubborn resistance would exhaust the enemy. This discrepancy generated an atmosphere of frustration among the officers, who saw their forces being wasted in an unequal fight. On the ground, the soldiers' situation grew increasingly difficult. Supply shortages were evident, with reduced rations and limited ammunition. The wounded overwhelmed the first aid stations, where medics worked tirelessly under enemy fire. Later accounts describe scenes of makeshift hospitals in basements and barns, with rows of stretchers and the constant sound of explosions outside. Despite everything, the German defenders held their ground in every village and on every road. The fighting was fierce, with ambushes, gun battles in narrow streets and night attacks. The infantry used every hedge and every wall as cover, trying to halt the Allied advance inch by inch. However, the difference in means was so great that the fall of each position seemed inevitable. The Allies, aware of this advantage, advanced systematically, supported by massive bombardments that devastated the German lines. Columns of smoke could be seen for miles around, and the number of German prisoners increased every day. For the Reich troops, the feeling was that they were being pushed hopelessly deeper into France, with no real possibility of regaining the... By late June, reports from the German High Command acknowledged that the situation in Normandy was untenable. The divisions were exhausted, the tanks destroyed, and the German Air Force reduced to marginal operations. Rundstedt again requested permission to withdraw and reorganize a more solid line, but Hitler responded angrily, insisting that each position must hold to the end. This rigidity determined the fate of the forces in the West. In July 1944, the German situation in Normandy was unsustainable. The divisions were exhausted, and Allied air power prevented any maneuvers during the day. Every attempt to move tanks or supplies ended in air raids that destroyed entire convoys. German commanders reported constant losses and a complete inability to halt the enemy advance. Rommel again insisted on the need to withdraw toward the Seine, but in the middle of the month, his vehicle was severely attacked by air forces near Livarot, leaving him seriously wounded. His absence left Army Group B without its most respected commander at the front. An increasingly frustrated Rundstedt was also removed soon after, replaced by Klug, who inherited a desperate situation. Meanwhile, the Allies launched a series of offensives that ultimately broke through the German lines. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, opened a gap west of St. Lo. German units that attempted to resist were overwhelmed by artillery and air firepower, the remaining infantry scattered into small groups, unable to halt the advance. The consequence was the Falaise encirclement in August. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in a rapidly closing pocket. The chaos was absolute. Columns of vehicles blocked the roads, Allied artillery bombarded incessantly, and aircraft attacked relentlessly. German accounts spoke of scenes of total destruction with burning tanks, dead horses on the roads, and soldiers trying to escape on foot under fire. The High Command in Berlin ordered a stand within the encirclement, but many officers realized it was impossible. Thousands of men died or were taken prisoner, and the divisions that managed to escape did so without weapons or cohesion, reduced to fragments of their former selves. The defeat at Falaise meant the annihilation of Army Group B as an effective force. At the end of August, the remnants of the German army in France began a hasty retreat toward the Seine. Units moved at night, pursued by aircraft and harassed by local resistance. Cities like Paris were out of German control within days. The dream of holding a line in the west was over. The retreat did not stop until it reached the Reich's border. The Allied invasion had achieved what Rommel and Rundstedt had warned of from the beginning. Once the Allies established their beachhead, nothing could stop their advance. For the German soldiers who survived, the retreat was the bitter recognition that the Atlantic Wall had never been an insurmountable wall, but an illusion that collapsed within weeks under the pressure of an enemy superior in every respect.